Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first Directors' Seminar of the new academic year. I am Professor Henrietta Moore, and I am the founder and director of the Institute for Global Prosperity. And I'm delighted to see so many of you here this afternoon, and thank you very much for coming. So the subject of this afternoon's discussion is how can we adapt our prosperity thinking for the challenges of the 21st century. Now, the event we're going to have this afternoon with a wonderful group of speakers who form our panel is a one-off because it's here to celebrate the publication of a new book which has been published by the IGP, which for many of you in this room will be quite literally your handbook for the rest of the year. So please pay close attention. But before we get into that, I just want to talk to you a little bit about the directors' seminars in general for the term. So these seminars always have a theme, and this term the theme is the cultural spaces for democratic participation, political expression, and shared prosperity. So what we're going to explore in this term, seminars and soundbites, is how citizens mobilize new physical and digital channels of political participation, and what can be done to create and adapt these cultural spaces so that they make a positive impact on democratic life in the 21st century. On the one hand, conventional forms of political participation, such as elections and party politics, have suffered from disengagement, disinformation, political polarization, and a growing distance between citizens and their elective representatives. But on the other hand, citizens continuously reframe the boundaries of democratic politics by creating alternative outlets for democratic participation. And these more perhaps unconventional forms of political expression, which include physical and online collective action, street protests, subversion, and different kinds of activism, have become key channels for deliberation and alternative engagement, and perhaps for certain sections of the population more than others. So the series this term will examine how physical and online cultural and artistic spaces, such as cultural centers and parks and public libraries and social media platforms and the metaverse, can channel that bottom-up political energy, become vectors of political expression, and feed into wider political debates. And it will explore also what policies, experiments, and designs are needed to support these new forms of democratic participation. So that series will kick off with the second director seminar of the year. But what we're here to do now is to celebrate the publication of the new book, Prosperity in the 21st Century, Concepts, Models, and Metrics. And in this book, we set out a new way of thinking, a new vision of prosperity for the 21st century. What's wonderful about this book is that it's open access. You can download it for free anywhere in the world and read it. But it does more than challenge orthodox understandings of economic models. It goes beyond those contemporary debates to show how social innovation is what really drives economic innovation. It draws on the substantive work that we have been doing in the UK and in Lebanon and in Kenya. And it develops new frameworks and concepts and models and metrics for prosperity across a wide range of contexts. Of course, emphasizing commonalities, but also emphasizing differences. And it's really about what will make prosperity a realizable proposition for everyone living in the specific places that they are living in now. So it's a major challenge, it's a major statement. And we've been joined this evening by four wonderful speakers who have agreed to link their thinking and their work to some of what is in the book, and to give you the benefit of their thoughts on how they see this challenging question of how do we define prosperity today in the 21st century. So may I introduce who's sitting in the yellow, that's Professor Joe Beale. Professor Beale is Emeritus Professor and Distinguished Policy Fellow at the LSE and has conducted research across sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia on urban development and governance, as well as cities in situations of conflict and state frailty. She was formerly the Global Director of Education and Cultural Education for the British Council and Deputy Vice-Chancellor at the University of Cape Town. Dr. Matthew Davis, who's on my immediate left, is Deputy Director of the MacDonald Institute for Archaeological Research at the University of Cambridge. Prior to this, he was Director of Education and Associate Professor here at the Institute for Global Prosperity. Dr. Davis's primary research focuses on the contemporary and historical management of landscapes, ecological diversity, climate, and questions of sustainability, resilience, and regeneration in Africa. And Dr. Davis is one of the editors of the New Prosperity in the 21st Century book. Let me introduce next. On line is Dr. Marit Hammond, who's number 3 in the row there. She is lecturer in politics at the School of Social, Political and Global Studies at Keele University. And Dr. Hammond's research interest is in democratic theory and environmental political theory and how those two things intersect. She's currently working on a reconceptualization of deliberative democracy as a political culture, an approach to sustainability as social ecological resilience, and new approaches to democratic sustainability politics and eco-citizenship. And at the end of our panel, on my left, Dr. Ruth Yeoman. Dr. Yeoman is a fellow of Kellogg College at the University of Oxford, where she leads a number of important research projects, including one on ownership, leadership, and meaningful work, one on values to shared value creation, and a third on the meaningful city. She writes on the importance of meaningful work, how we can find meaningful work, and researches the ethics and practice of mutuality in co-owned and conventionally owned enterprises. So I'm going to start by asking Professor Beale to say a few words, and then we will continue from there. So, Jo, please.
Thank you, Henrietta, and good evening, everyone. I was absolutely delighted and absolutely daunted when I read the manuscript of this book, which was a wonderful experience. It's a great book and a great outcome. But I was daunted because I have spent much of my life as an academic thinking about poverty, in particular urban poverty, but thinking about poverty, a little bit about inequality, something about social exclusion. And of course, this book turns that whole way of thinking, the whole paradigm on which my own research and career was immersed, on its head. I looked at the poverty that resulted from the uneven way in which international development operated, where some countries got richer and others got poorer, or some were just ignored altogether. I looked at poverty that sat cheek by jowl with wealth in cities that were growing rapidly and becoming more unequal by the day. And I looked at poverty in conflict-affected regions of the world, for example, Afghanistan, where people who had been formerly quite well off were reduced to conditions of poverty as a result of war. Looking back, I remember on many field trips, people looking a bit quizzically at me, wondering why I was identifying them as poor. People don't always think of themselves as poor. And I was first challenged to think in the way that this book approaches world problems by a student of mine at the LSE from Vietnam. And I was doing a lecture on the intergenerational transmission of poverty. And she said to me, well, why don't you look at the intergenerational transmission of prosperity? I don't know if she used those exact words, but that's what she meant. And she talked about her mother, who had been affected by the war in Vietnam, had worked in very lowly employment and had scrimped and saved for her education. And she said education is the vehicle by which I am no longer poor and my family will never again be poor. And I tell you that story because I think that's what this book is all about. It's about saying, let's start from where people are, how they think about themselves, how they aspire, and then use that as the basis for a paradigm that is going to look differently at the world. So what the book does is it challenges existing economic paradigms that start with good equals growth in GDP, and says, no, let's think about the world where good equals inclusive societies, green economies, and that measures success by people's well-being. It's a big task. It's going against decades and decades of history and philosophy and theory and action. All our global institutions, World Bank, UNDP, IMF, are all based on thinking that that equals progress. It's a new field. Global prosperity studies have been in existence for about a quarter of a century. And this book is innovative within that field because what it's doing is saying, let's look at this at a multi-scalar level. In other words, we're looking at global prosperity at a global level, at national level, at local government level, but from the perspectives of ordinary people on the ground. And I think that is what makes this book innovative in what is already a very brand new field. So you're very lucky to be here, to be studying something that is so cutting edge, and to have as your, what did you call it? You're not your Bible, but your
handbook.
Your handbook, a book of this quality and importance. So it breaks new ground because it's drawing on debates within the social sciences, debates within environmental studies, debates within international development, to engage critically with existing growth-centered paradigms. It calls for more optimistic notions of prosperity. It doesn't ignore the structural conditions, you know, those big imponderables that are so hard to engage with. But it doesn't ignore those, but it says the agency of ordinary people, of citizen scientists who are looking at their own conditions, dilemmas, institutions, decision makers, that those have to be in conversation. So the introductory chapter, which Henrietta wrote, adds to the heft of the argument. The second chapter by Henrietta and Nikolai offers a theoretical framing for the argument, advocates pathways. So often academic papers are very good at critique, but they don't tell you what to do after that. This offers pathways to prosperity, and it gives a measurement of quality of life. So when I was working in the field, I was looking at multi-dimensional ways of measuring poverty. This is saying, no, look at measurements of quality of life. That's what people are aspiring to. It doesn't mean that it ignores poverty, inequality, social exclusion, and all these things, but it starts from where people are thinking about it. And it includes chapters that apply this thinking in practice in cases that are as diverse as rural Kenya, East London just round the corner, and Lebanon. And so it covers all the things that I looked at under or through a different lens, the impact of conflict and war on people's livelihoods, social fragmentation, poverty and inequality. But the lens is what is important, because how you look at things informs how you solve problems. So the value of this book to engage scholarship is how very authoritative research and analysis gives way to transformative pathways. And I'm going to conclude just by saying something I said when I reviewed the manuscript, which is in a world beset by global recession, environmental challenges, and socio-political crises. This book shows how obsession with GDP has not solved these problems and indeed has created them in part. Instead, it suggests building prosperity differently understood as residing in the people who live it, and as such, it's a volume that offers reasons for hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jo. So, Matt, can I ask you to say a few words now, please?
Yes, thank you, Henrietta, and thank you all for coming to listen. Mr. Sunak, our Prime Minister, has been quite a busy boy over the last couple of weeks, I think. And I won't comment on the fun of this week, but last week's U-turn on combustion engine vehicles, I think, is illustrative of a wider question as to why we allow certain generalist politicians with backgrounds in economics to make decisions of critical planetary significance, even when all of the experts disagree. So the responses from the car industry itself were quite illuminating. The Ford Motor Vehicle Company, which is hardly the world's moral compass, said, "Our business needs ambition, commitment, and consistency. A relaxation of 2030 would undermine all three." Auto Trader, one of the largest car sales organizations, said this U-turn is a hugely retrograde step which puts politics ahead of net zero goals. So what I really want to talk about is the question of how we get the right people with the right knowledge in the right place at the right time to make the right decisions. But before doing so, I want to take a bit of a step back and think about how we understand, how we model, and how we enact change more generally, because I think that's a key theme of this volume. And we hear terms like complexity, resilience, sustainability, regeneration, and of course growth all of the time. And each of those implies certain visions of change with certain dynamics to that change. So some of them model change as non-linear and unpredictable. Some see it as linear and scalar with a certain direction. Some see it as linear and directional but punctuated. Some emphasize stasis or equilibrium. Others emphasize tipping points, phase shifts, feedbacks, and circularity. And not all of those visions of change are at all compatible. What we do all know, and I think we all know instinctively, is that the world is hyper complex, that the interactions of 7.8 billion humans with trillions of other plant and animal species, with an atmospheric climate and weather system that we can have a good go at, but we can't yet fully model. And then if we add in geophysical processes, soil formation, chemistry, erosion, deposition, tectonics, ocean feedbacks, and all of this before we even begin to think about markets, technology, and dare I mention it, AI. So it's fairly obvious that the world is super complex, but just stating that complexity probably doesn't help us very much. And nor am I convinced that solutions will stem in themselves from hyper-complex modeling or simulation. Do we need to be able to predict the movement of every human, or every sentient being, or every molecule, or every atom? And do we need to model this for a city, for a country, for the whole Earth, or the solar system? Such simulations will no doubt be useful heuristics, but I'm not convinced we can rely on simulations and computing power alone. And while modeling of this kind is ongoing, to what extent is that modeling filtering into the policy planning of everyday life, where visions for change of the future and the mechanisms or levers for that change seem still rather simple, rather linear? So, for example, despite our recognition of all of this complexity, we still seem to think that there's one kind of trajectory into the future, a kind of obvious or objective future which will emerge, almost a utopian one that will be realized, and that when we finally get there, that we will be able to manage or maintain that perfect future indefinitely somehow. And politicians and others might debate how they think we should get there. So should we tweak things with changing taxes a little bit, or should we increase or decrease interest rates? Should we invest more in education, healthcare, or social services? Or should we let the market take care of these things? But these simple levers for change, whichever we choose, I think seem wholly inadequate against the complexity that we're really trying to affect. So for me, in other words, the choices that we really face in the 21st century, as the question of this session sets up, aren't really those that are between different policy options, because all of them are a little bit limited, but rather we face a series of questions around a much bigger set of choices as to how we make and manage constant ongoing change in a hyper-complex world where there are no fixed start and end points, no linear pathways between them, no hope for long-term equilibrium or stasis, or no hope for equilibrium in an idealized future. In other words, a world where unpredictable change needs to be accepted as the norm, not as something that can be designed out through policy. So in the MSc Global Prosperity a few years ago, we used to discuss this kind of complexity. And we used to talk about the way in which recognizing this hypercomplexity can be kind of stifling because you don't know what to do with it. It describes the world as you know it, but you don't quite know how to act within it. It offers no clear pathways for change. And what we did within the MSc Global Prosperity is we focused on several possible models for change, largely drawn from socio-technical transition studies. So things like the multi-level perspective, the three horizons model, resilience theory. And I'm not sure if the current crop of students will talk about these, thinking may have moved on beyond me, but these models, while they're flawed in many ways, they're very heuristically useful, I think, because they have sort of the right amount of complexity built into them. They offer, they sit between those extreme visions of complexity and these much more simple linear models for change. And where they still fall down is that they still posit this sort of idea of a starting point, which models the status quo, where we are today, and then imagine some kind of future state that we might like to achieve. For example, starting with a fossil fuel-based economy and ending up with a renewables economy, or starting with a first-past-the-post representative democratic system and ending up with widespread democratic participation through citizens' assemblies. But where they are really useful is that they ask us to consider the complex interconnections between the drivers of change between those states, getting us to think more clearly about relationships between environment, economy, governance, and innovation, and breaking this complexity down into manageable chunks. And what I think one realizes when you start to examine those models for change is the need for cross-sector decision-making that doesn't just apply only the drivers for change, but which manages those unpredictable transitions in real time as they occur and with the appropriate knowledge and expertise on hand. In fact, one might begin to think of policy levers not so much as pathways to change in themselves, but as necessary experiments, opportunities to learn, to test things, to try multiple pathways for change simultaneously, because in a complex world, singular pathways are unlikely to work by themselves. So for example, in the three horizons model, which posits the need for a H2 horizon, which is a transitional phase between states, the H2 state might be better conceived as not as a singular phenomenon, but as many simultaneous experiments, all taking slightly different approaches to the same basic conditions and similar future ambitions. And I think the IGP itself is a good example of this. So Prosperity Collabs, Fast Forward 2030, the work towards universal basic services. Each of these are experimental initiatives working with the same basic parameters towards related goals, but with distinct yet overlapping approaches, and with foundations based in collective design, expertise, and responsiveness to adapt to emergent phenomena or emergent challenges. And these, I think, are not just projects to effect transition from one state to another, but actually projects designed to design institutions that are themselves responses to managing or shaping change in a complex world, where, as I said before, change is viewed not as atypical, not as something that shouldn't really happen, but where change is a constant and can't be designed out. So in Chapter 8 of the Prosperity volume, written by Timothy Kipkeo, Wilson Kipkore, Samuel Lunn Rockcliffe, and myself, we effectively argued that many communities around the world already possess powerful understandings of complexity, and that they curate institutions which are flexible enough to shape or mold emergent challenges as they occur. So in other words, where social structures are configured precisely to deal with the unknown or the unpredictable, where multiple forms of knowledge, practice, and skills can be mobilized at any one time. And I won't go into any detail here because I'd like you all to read the book instead. But we suggest that the Marakwet of Kenya, for example, shape emergent challenges constantly through deeply ingrained social mechanisms, such as means of knowledge sharing and pooled resources via wide social networks which exist across ecologies. They do so through distributed decision-making, including through widespread councils called kokwa. They maintain, have a very ingrained sense of maintaining both human and ecological diversity. And they engage in constant lived innovation and experimentation, not as a singular act, but as they're part of their daily lives. And in a previous paper, Henrietta and I described mechanisms such as this as cultural resilience. I am finishing up then. Collectively, what I think they are then are highly effective means of widespread experimentation, knowledge sharing, and distributed decision-making founded on a diversity of ideas, perspectives, and skills. A good way to describe them might be as forms of heterarchy, where different parts of the knowledge and decision-making fabric are mobilized to address challenges at different times. And I think this brings us all the way back circle to the Prime Minister and the government's questionable decision-making. How we begin to envisage alternative ways of getting the right knowledge and the right people in the right place at the right time. So to address this directly to the question of this session, how do we adapt our prosperity thinking for the 21st century? My simple answers, which don't have simple solutions, would be that we need to embrace unpredictable or emergent change, and then we need to build the institutions that shape that emergence. And I think there are many good examples of this around the world, and things like prosperity collabs are certainly a very good start to it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Matt. And now let us turn and hear from Dr. Marit Hammond. So Marit, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to discuss the book. And where my work intersects with it, I guess, is through my work in CUSP, the ESRC Center for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity, which shares the vision of prosperity as not just GDP, but as a holistic version of, a more holistic vision of well-being. Sorry. And inclusive well-being, inclusive quality of life in a society. And so my work within CUSP has been looking at the political foundations of sustainable prosperity, and in that context specifically also the question of how politically our societies could deliberately transform themselves as radically as that would require. So I want in this talk to touch a bit upon the different dimensions that have come into this and that have shaped my current perspective on what sustainable prosperity means in the 21st century, how it links with democracy and how it links with cultural meanings and the arts. So one element that I want to draw particular attention to in this is the role of political power in shaping these important discourses, because a word like sustainability that has become a buzzword but is in itself empty has always attracted those trying to shape it in a certain direction that suited them from their interested perspective. And prosperity and even democracy can be similar. So it's important to come at these discussions with a very considered definition of the terms. And as a political philosopher, I would caution also that it's important to be quite clear on the conceptual, intrinsic connections between prosperity, sustainability, and democracy. Because if we treat any of those as sort of added on desiderata rather than intrinsically connected, they are vulnerable to being discarded again as the crisis becomes more dire. So how people sometimes say these days that freedom and democracy may now be luxuries that we can't afford anymore given the severity of the climate crisis. So in my work, I show why democracy is not just an ethical commitment or the politically correct way of approaching sustainable prosperity, but it is the only way to bring it about. And part of the reason, or central part of the reason, is the role that political power otherwise plays in obstructing that kind of societal transformation. So in terms of the intrinsic link between sustainability and prosperity, there's two things to say. The first thing to note is that sustainability is not the same as survival. So sometimes, again, as we talk about the severity and urgency of the crisis, it seems as if sustainability is just about surviving this crisis, this threat that is abnormal and it's temporary, and we just need to restore the world as it has been before. But that is an illusion, because of course, actually, as Matthias said, I couldn't agree more. We're part of a social ecological system that is constantly changing, where change is normal, it's expected. And in fact, we know from resilience scholars that the more we try to contain change, the more we try to manage the social ecological system, the more vulnerable it is to experiencing abrupt and catastrophic system change, like state shifts. And so the more static a definition of sustainability we're trying to impose, the more actually at risk we leave ourselves to those sudden, more catastrophic changes. So to me, sustainability actually is defined at the level of the patterns by which an inevitably changing society and an inevitably changing ecosystem co-evolve together. So insofar as a lasting and inclusive prosperity is predicated upon that overall stability in the social ecological system, it has these two preconditions. Firstly, a societal commitment to being adaptive to those conditions for the sake of human flourishing, inclusive human flourishing. And secondly, sufficient openness to being adaptive like that, to adapting to potentially radically new conditions where that is necessary. Now, this openness that is at the core of sustainability partly is material in nature, how close are we actually to certain tipping points and so on, but partly it is also cultural in nature, because partly openness or capacity for transformation of a society has to do with the society's perception of its social reality and its future options, which are formed by the sum of its members' thoughts and political imaginations and the extent to which they inform the public discourse, how they construct the social reality. So this shows that it is incredibly important, as this book does such a brilliant job of, to engage people in these discourses. It can change perceptions, it can change outlooks and produce new possibilities precisely by articulating them. But it also shows that a key barrier to sustainable prosperity can occur when the constructed social reality is being constrained or is being controlled by those with an interest in obstructing change. And so that happens where political power operates not just in the sort of traditional one agent is disciplining or overpowering another, kind of quite visible and quite direct way of exercising political power. But at its trickiest level, political power creates a sort of political grammar that sets the bounds of what is perceptible, thinkable, and sayable politically in a certain society, and therefore constructs and potentially locks in a certain reality. So this kind of grammar then constructs our political identities. It creates a certain form of politics. It sets the bounds of common sense and therefore can predetermine a certain pathway that society can or can't take. So in order for a society to actually be fully open to being adaptable and transformable in the way that sustainable prosperity requires, it must be able to transcend these limitations of what is visible, thinkable, and sayable in the realm of meanings or the cultural realm of society. So concretely, this might take the form of quite critical discourses in society. For example, those challenging the otherwise maybe mainstream thought or taken for granted thought that it's green growth that must be the answer, or creating alternative visions for the future that might so radically be meaningful to people that they might motivate much more radical action in people than they otherwise would have taken. And the crux is that the more diverse and broad-ranging these discourses are, the better able will they be at transcending the limitations, the boundaries of an otherwise constraining political grammar. So this is what ties sustainable prosperity to democracy as a necessary political foundation. So sustainable prosperity needs democracy not just as a way of engaging people, or not just instrumentally as a useful tool for bringing about certain ecologically useful outcomes, but it needs it intrinsically for two reasons. Firstly, because as a broader vision than just survival, sustainability contains within its definition the visions, the hopes, the values that make up what is meaningful to people, the vision of a meaningful life in the context of generally changing ecosystemic conditions. And those differ between people and between places, as the book beautifully shows. And the second reason is that democracy is needed as what withstands and stands up to the political power that is at its most oppressive when it's as invisible as constructing a certain grammar that constrains our perception of reality. So this underlying dimension of power is what needs to be addressed first for any transformation, any change towards a different future pathway to become possible. So here it's the abstract norm of democracy that is needed as what withstands political domination. And so the crux is that sustainable prosperity not only requires it, but democratic empowerment then in and of itself constitutes an embodiment of sustainability. And so I think that's deliberative democracy that does that better than liberal democracy. And it has become very popular recently with all the climate assemblies to use deliberative democracy as a way of addressing prosperity in the face of the climate crisis. But often it's not known that the origins of that theory aren't actually those assemblies, those constructed spaces that make citizens discuss these matters in a certain way. But the origin of that theory is to counteract all forms of domination in society, including those invisible ones that shape our perceptions and shape what we can articulate politically. And so it's at that level where democracy fulfills its function, really, it becomes the crux of sustainable prosperity. But that can't be designed. So kind of to end with the question also from the abstract of what kind of policies or experiments or designs do we need to enable the democratic participation that we need, my thinking is that the problem is that we can't design it into place. We can't design genuinely critical perspectives into place. We can't instruct citizens to have the right outlooks or to act in a certain way, and that producing the kinds of empowerment that pushes against the boundaries of the political grammar. So the problem is, if we have too little design, what is going to happen, and is it going to be democratic? So to me, what I want to end with is the thought that sustainable prosperity can't find a shortcut around genuine democratization. Even our understanding of democracy itself needs to be democratized further so that it's critical and bottom-up in nature to be able to push against the kind of colonizations, as Habermas would put it, even of its own meaning. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Marit. Thank you for that very clear statement. And now let's turn to Dr. Ruth Yeoman. Ruth, please.
Thank you very much, Henrietta. Hello, everybody. It's great to be with you all. Thank you, Henrietta, for inviting me, and thanks to you and your colleagues for your inspiring new book on prosperity in the 21st century. So for me, on reading this book, a central question lies behind the research that's been done, which is how to reimagine, in community with others, the different ways we can provision all lives, both human and non-human, with the sustainable means for flourishing. And of course, as the other speakers have alluded to, answers have to be sought not only at national and international levels, but also in the places where we live and work. But our ability to connect different scales of economic organising is confronted, I think, with two crises that are aggravating a loss of trust in democratic capitalism: a crisis of meaning and a crisis of justice. But by which I mean, firstly, a crisis of public meaning, or the shared narratives where we find overlapping values for collective action. And secondly, a crisis in multidimensional justice. So specifically here, justice in production and distribution, participatory justice, and narrative justice, which I understand as the interactional power of each citizen to influence the formation of positive, life-enriching narratives, and so is intimately connected to the creation of public meaning. And we need both justice and meaning for a stable and enduring democratic society. Lacking these two fundamental requirements feeds into authoritarian challenges to democracy. For example, our need for meaning makes us vulnerable to those whom Professor Stephen Riker calls entrepreneurs of hate. Meaningfulness as a moral structure related to becoming emotionally connected to something which is objectively worthwhile, significant, or in some way valuable. But well-placed meaning crafters, such as political populists or wealthy individuals, can use their interactive privilege to create zombie meaningfulness. It's a new phrase which I've made up, meaning that is emptied of its moral content, but which still mimics the structure of meaningfulness and can result in cult-like political parties or even totalitarian states. To repair meaning and restore justice in our economic practices, I argue for the systemic institution of a neglected economic principle, that of mutuality. The principle of mutuality can be understood expansively using the language of social justice. It describes the structural conditions under which we're prepared to join our efforts to those of others in order to secure together what one cannot secure alone. In economic practices, mutuality is manifested in having a voice in collective action, an equal share of decision-making power, and a fair share of the benefits and burdens that arise from shared economic activities. So, for example, perhaps a proto-mutual economy can be seen in the Preston City model of community wealth building, which I encourage you all to explore if you have not done so already. Mutuality draws upon human behaviour that values reciprocity and fairness in cooperation, but it goes further than reciprocity, encompassing values of care and mutual flourishing. In his 2002 Structures of Mutual Obligation, the political theorist Robert Goodin said of reciprocity, "Giving you back the same Christmas present you gave me earlier in the day may constitute a paradigm case of lockstep reciprocity, but it is definitely not a friendly gesture. If what we want norms of reciprocity to do for us is to bind us together into a community of shared fate, then that form of reciprocity is actually contraindicated. Rather, mutuality is a way of being in the world that taps into narratives of stewardship, mutual aid, and mutual concern, describing limits as to how we treat other people and other non-human creatures. Mutuality brings forward forms of relatedness that put us into each other's care, expanding our circles of concern to include other living beings and things. The climate crisis, of course, has made it especially important that we experiment with economic practices, engaging us in positive, attentive, caring relationships to other living beings and things. And this is not a new preoccupation. In a 1649 speech, Gerard Winstanley said, "The great creator reason made the earth to be a common treasury to preserve beasts, birds, fishes, and man." Perspectives of this kind, brought up to date into the modern world and into our public debate, stimulate meaning flows around the values people want to satisfy in their associational life. It provides them with cultural and narrative resources to engage in practical reasoning, build up common knowledge, and coordinate joint endeavour. But the challenge is not only institutional, it is also psychological. In his book, To Have and to Be, Erich Fromm says, "For the first time in history, the physical survival of the human race depends upon a radical change of the human heart." In other words, we need a form of social recognition or awareness of others that helps us to understand how our flourishing depends upon their flourishing. Rather than fitting valuable beings and things to our needs, Fromm suggests that we make ourselves available to them in what he calls a process of mutual alive relatedness, a process where we become willing to change ourselves for their sake. Mutual change, where the benefits and burdens of change are fairly shared so that all may flourish together, restores both meaning and justice. It spotlights the importance of public meaningfulness, the function positive meaning, as opposed to zombie meaningfulness, plays in social and economic systems. Such functions include helping people resist dismay and anxiety arising from threats to established ways of life, encouraging resilience as a public good, which prepares communities and whole societies for the disruptions of adaptation, or for even more radical change if adaptation proves insufficient. We need democratic cultural spaces abundant with positive meanings that are activated by narrative justice. spaces governed by participatory justice and enabled by distributive justice. The aims of such spaces is the emergence of ecological civilizations with democratic foundations. This will not come without struggle and work. Right now, we see right-wing politicians undermining sustainability transitions, such as the rollback on net zero by Rishi Sunak's administration. But this has been countered by organising citizens. Business Declares announced publicly that it remains determined to help businesses stay on course to net zero. And we see children taking governments to court for their right to life and a future. A collective norm rooted in sustainability is becoming established in business, despite efforts to discredit long-standing initiatives such as ESG frameworks. And to aid this progress, we must add the tools of economic organisation, such as joint decision-making at multiple levels, organisations and work designed around the mutuality principle and shared ownership, and common capital, such as sovereign wealth funds directed to public goods. Needless to say, these are forms of economic organisation such as we're not really very familiar with right now. They're democratic forms of economic organisation that we need to spread across the system. The associational life of nations, including businesses, can resist populist politics and enable citizens to satisfy the values that matter to them. We have tended to assume that democracies are the means to prepare people for participation in the economy. But in a persistent strand of thinking from John Stuart Mill to the contemporary cooperative movement, the economy is seen as a social context for preparing people for democratic citizenship. And some of the emergent economic practices we need to achieve this mutual dynamism are outlined in the new book we're celebrating today. So go and read.
Well, thank you all very much for very brilliant interventions this evening. Now, normally in the Director's Seminar, the discussion would proceed with me interrogating whoever has just given the paper. But since there are 4 of you, I don't think we have time for that, and I want to open up immediately to the floor and get some ideas from people in the room. So we've heard a discussion really of how prosperity is allied to a new framework, which is quite different from that of the existing one around development and ideas about poverty. We've heard about prosperity and its role in modelling and enacting change and in building institutions that can shape emergent change. We've heard about how prosperity might link to democracy and issues of political power and the role of deliberative democracy in setting the bounds of common sense and motivating people more effectively from change. And we've also heard about the relationship between a crisis of meaning and a crisis of justice, how we can expand our circle of concerns through ideas about mutuality to address the role of voice in collective action and in ethical positions more generally. So let me open up to the floor, and please don't be shy. Yes, please, question here. The microphones are going round, so if you put your hand up ahead of time, I will see you. Yeah, please.
Thank you for a wonderful introduction and obviously reading literature, quite extensive. However, as we know, Stiglitz and Stern, back about 15 years ago, have also undertaken a similar project with a group of other economists. And although they produced a very extensive material, reading material themselves, we can say that people in some other places like Caribbeans have actually, I'm referring to people who are investors there, who are investment managers, have completely ignored and they continue to work, and as I say, caravan continues. So I don't know, how do you think you can achieve any effect other than counseling the people around yourself and maybe gathering people around, but because there are a lot of talk about something called, let's say, democracy, or even people kind of having their own assemblies. But if these assemblies and democracy has no power of imposing, but just being consultative to other politicians, there is no actually really a mechanism to make any conclusions of this kind of work working. Can you explain it?
Well, I could, yes, but I'm going to ask Matt too, because he talked about emergent institutions, and also he's been part of the IGP, so he knows the position on that. So Matt, yeah.
I had a feeling that was coming.
Yeah.
And it's a massive challenge, as you rightly point out, and that it's not one that hasn't been attempted before. I think one of the points that I was trying to make is that we need lots of experimentation, and that experimentation must be targeted in real practical ways. And I think I gave some examples from the IGP's own work. The idea of prosperity laboratories, which bring together citizens who are engaged in research, critical research into their own communities with local policymakers, and I think that local focus and regional focus rather than necessarily national to begin with is really key there. But bringing them together around certain research questions where they co-generate information and then co-generate solutions, I think is a really powerful way forward. And the way in which IGP is almost, maybe we talked before about trying to almost franchise these kinds of prosperity collabs. So we are establishing many in many locations around the world, but trying to encourage others to think about how they might replicate that model. I think Fast Forward 2030 is another fantastic example of working with networks of young entrepreneurs who are going out there and they are working to generate their own change-making enterprises. So it's very bottom up, and it's not necessarily courting high-level politicians, but it's from the ground up with people designing their own initiatives, activities, businesses, etc. that embody this. For me, the other key model is this room. It's things like the educational projects that the IGP is engaged in, and the fact that you have 100 or so students here, and you've had 600-700 over the last however many years who are all going out to be part of this project. I think that is a way of scaling up, and I think we're going to see more educational programs in other institutions all around the world offering similar kinds of inspiration. So those would be three key ones for me.
Three key ones for you. Good, excellent. So shall we have do we have another question? Yes, please, here.
Hi, I'm Leah and I'm on the Global Prosperity Masters. I really like their points and I feel like there's a lot of hope for the future. Something that comes to my mind when we're discussing deliberative democracy and involving citizens is how divided people are, especially at the grassroots, and with conspiracy, populism, resurgence of right-wing sentiments, which is obviously being stirred up at the top level, but it is still, it seems to have really caught hold. And especially when you look at the spreading of misinformation on social media and things, sort of, how can we incorporate and involve as many people as possible and give everyone a voice, but still be mindful of some of it might not be where we might like it to go, or the visions that we have, if that makes sense.
Yes, yes. Morat, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, thank you. And of course you're completely right, and that's part of the challenge. And I think it's part of the whole problem of, actually I love that word, zombie meaningfulness. I'm going to use that in my work going forward. So that like almost kind of like it has eroded, that there's been this culture that has eroded kind of real meaning in people's lives, and also therefore kind of real political participation and engagement. And it actually plays in the hands of those who want to obstruct transformation. So again, I think there's no shortcut around that. It's not enough to have a citizens' assembly, because of course deliberative democracy is precisely what wants to counteract that misinformation and kind of fake news and all of that is actually part of the whole machinery of domination. But it's not enough to kind of put people in the room and tell them, okay, ignore all of that now, because that's what the deliberative principle is. It's going to be a longer term cultural shift in our political culture, in our democratic culture. And actually, I didn't kind of get around to saying that in my talk in the 10 minutes. But as an alternative, not just critiquing, but having an alternative, I do think there's really important work being done at the moment that links new democratic spaces with, for example, public art, participatory art, as spaces that aren't so instructed or kind of citizens are invited to play a very specific role and follow the specific instructions, and all of that still gives them the sense that they can't have like a self-empowerment and kind of escape the constraints of the political through their own motivation. Whereas artistic spaces tend to be playful, they tend to be imaginative, but in a freer way, in a more exploratory way. And so we're doing some work actually with my colleague Malika Cunningham on her participatory theatre piece, the People's Palace of Possibility, that tries to create this kind of playful, imaginative space, but just as a way of bringing different topics into the conversation, different visions, like playing around with different views of different ways of seeing the world. And I think that experimentation and imagination is the critical first step to also then challenge conspiracy theories and misinformation that are part of the dominated discourse.
Oh, yes, question here, please.
Sure, thank you. My name is Prook. I'm from the Global Prosperity Program. Just to follow up on Leia's question, also for you, Dr. Merritt, we as students of prosperity would like to know how to navigate a world which is still dominated by self-interest. And I was speaking in the context where, we've got so many people around the room from so many places. We don't have the luxury of democracy in every place that we come from. And maybe when we graduate, we're going to go back to these countries. We're going to face roadblocks, obstacles, people who might not want to help the agenda or might actually obstruct it. What would be your advice to us when we look at prosperity and try to take it forward? Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, that's a really inspiring question, I think, to all of us, because it shows what meaning this work has, that you can take it back to your home country and make some real impact with it. And again, my answer is at a theoretical level is deliberative democracy, because it takes self-interest to be part of domination. So it wants to counteract all forms of domination, including those that stem from being guided by one's self-interest and therefore trying to sort of dominate the other, to just push through your self-interest. But of course, that's the theoretical promise. And again, it's the trickier question is how to achieve that in practice. But I also think, in a way, the limitations of these mini-publics, kind of citizen assemblies, that form of trying to institute deliberative democracy, the fact that that is limited is not just bad news, because I think it also shows that there are avenues to implement deliberative democracy that you can do yourself, that can spread in a bottom-up way. And that is through a cultural shift, just a shift in understanding yourself as a citizen. So I see culture is the kind of the sum of all norms and expectations and meanings in society. And that includes, for example, political culture would include the culture of what is a normal expectation to have as a citizen. So if citizens start to expect of those in power to justify their stances, and if they expect something more of kind of formal politics than kind of an interested sort of like a dueling of kind of trying to kind of win the argument. If they have a different expectation and make that known in the public discourse, that can change the political culture. And actually that bottom-up political culture that you can inspire yourself by talking to people, by changing your own mindset and kind of spreading that in your communities, that actually ultimately can be the more powerful form of democratization than anything that we try to artificially put into place.
Yeah. Do we have more questions? Yes, there's a question at the back there.
Hello. First of all, thank you all for the points that you made. I'm from Turkey, and in the last 20 years, Turkey has democratically, very much backlogged. In 2016, for instance, we voted for a constitutional change that took democracy away from people and centralized power into the president. And we all said, most of us said yes to that. So my question is, when political disenfranchisement is so embedded in a society, and people become conservative of this new way of governing, how can you actually show people that they have rights, they have a voice, and, you know, they have actually agency, when they themselves do not actually want that agency to be, well, implemented or, like, you know, shown to them. Because as a climate activist back home, it's very hard to get people on board with even the simplest things. When the destruction is so fast, especially like a country in Turkey, because we're closer to the Ecuador, it just, like, the pace of change and pace of destruction do not match. And how can we actually make people aware of their power to change that dynamic from, you know, bottom up, basically?
Joe, did you want to come in there from some of your from past dealing in difficult situations of conflict, and also where the state doesn't work and where there is a strong push against the citizens and their aspirations?
Yes, thank you very much for sharing that example and for your question. I have worked in many countries that experience very similar conditions to what you're talking about. And sometimes, if I take Afghanistan as an example, sometimes what I've seen at local level is more democratic than anything I've ever seen in the UK, where we have a highly centralized system of politics where local government has been eroded, both in terms of its access to finances and power and ability, therefore, to innovate. However, there are, you know, if you're looking at social change, I think the multi-scalar view is important because there's only so much you can do at local level. So one of the interesting things for you to think about as you go forward is the idea of citizen assemblies and local things, and then how, and in a similar way, addressing your question, how you then take them forward and upwards to other scales of government. And I think that is, for me, the trickiest question. In Afghanistan, some of those councils at the local level were very consultative. They were male-dominated and had all sorts of problems associated with them and excluded lots of people, but they did consult and work on behalf of local communities. So it's how you make sure that that kind of local deliberation gets escalated. Mm. And you're probably better equipped than I am to answer that.
Yeah, well, actually, I mean, yeah, I completely agree. But I also wanted to say, maybe just in addition, you know, you're here, and that's brilliant. You know, there's all of you here from different parts of the world. At least we're in a globalized enough world, in a positive sense, that we can share experiences like that. And again, I think there's much to be said for, you know, using art, using imagination to kind of keep visions alive. I think the real problem, in a way, like the power has won over citizens, where people can't even imagine alternatives anymore. But you're here and you can see what's going on, you can criticize it. That's what we need in order to be able to, maybe it takes a bit of patience in this case, but as long as we can keep that alive and being able to kind of see alternatives and see different visions, that's what can maintain the hope and eventually bring change.
Yes, let's bring Ruth in here, because this is an example of the relationship between the crisis of meaning and the crisis of justice on a pretty grand scale. I mean, you know, so Afghanistan, current Turkey, other places. So did you want to say anything there?
Well, I certainly would not want to diminish at all the great struggles and noble struggles of people who live under more authoritarian systems at a state level. But in the United Kingdom, for example, we have now very strong authoritarian tendencies within a democratic society. And this has really eroded both our ability to express ourselves as democratic citizens and to participate fully in the democratic process. And our government has acted against us. For me, what is often forgotten in all of these conversations, whether we're talking about democratic states or more authoritarian states, is the associational fabric that kind of mediates between citizens and the state. So the associational fabric of civil society, of businesses, of various sorts of institutions is critical for both as a channel for democratic voice and for promoting new forms of democratic practices. And I think that even where governments sort of act against the interests of citizens, then it is possible for all of us, no matter how we're situated, to get involved at some level in associational life, in an organisation, in an institution, even if it is just observing from the outside and maybe writing the occasional letter to it because we want it to be critiqued, because it's important to us in some way. Maybe it caters for a significant public service. Maybe it's something related to our family or our friends. And if we attach ourselves to an organisation that matters to us, either as workers or as citizens, we maybe will find friends, other people who are doing likewise, and that can help us to mobilise. It can help to provide the material for the kinds of democratic spaces that we're talking about, because it starts to cluster meanings around the things that matter to us. And it is in this business of finding a thing that really matters to us that the whole of democratic life begins. And I think that the associational fabric, even in very difficult situations where the state is working against the interests of citizens, can provide a really flourishing format for people to actually express their voices.
Okay, so there was a question here, and then one there.
Thanks. At this point, all of our students have asked the same question I was going to ask, but probably better. You know, thinking about what we've heard lots of optimistic examples at a local scale or a municipal scale, and it's really what Joe said. But we struggle to come up with examples of national or transnational movements that are tying things together. Are there empirical examples out there that, you know, we can name or think about or discuss? And I do mean empirical examples.
Well, yes, there are. There are. So, yes, you can. But anyway, I'll ask Joe to come in a moment. But let's think a bit about the kind of conversations that are going on at the moment around at a national level in several countries across the world about a well-being economy, about rethinking the economy, about changing the way in which the economy is valued and the relationship between social and economic value. So that would include, for example, Scotland, it would include Iceland, it would include New Zealand, several other countries. So these are countries which are pushing for a change at the international level. And I've just come back from the Africa Climate Summit, and one of the most remarkable things there was the call for Africa to speak with one voice on this issue of how change will have to be promoted and defended, not at the local level, although that was under discussion, but in terms of changing the terms of the international financial architecture. So these conversations do go on at the top level, and they need to be connected to the conversations that go on at the bottom level as well. So Joe, please, sorry.
I think I was going to give a historical
Yes,
example
please.
that said the same thing, which is, you know, I spent a lot of my early life and research in South Africa under apartheid, and was involved personally in the struggle against apartheid. And there, what you did have that brought about change was multi-scalar engagement, because you had local level organization, often very clandestine. I mean, it was an oppressive regime, probably as bad, if not worse, than Turkey, where people were organizing, even if it was in church groups, masquerading, covering up other kinds of political activities and so on. But you also had at the global level the anti-apartheid movement. You had countries involved in supporting sanctions, and bilateral engagements with countries like Sweden, working really hard on behalf of and alongside the anti-apartheid movement. I mean, the interesting thing now, if you look at South Africa, where, you know, there's been quite a lot of reversals in terms of democracy, is I think that multi-scalar level might not be quite as robust. Although South Africa's engagement in the BRICS is an interesting one,
yes,
and giving rise to different kinds of elements. But I think looking historically and in the contemporary way, there's opportunities for hope.
Yeah. I'm going to take the last question of the evening, which is there, and then I think...
Thank you all for all the ideas. I think they really enlighten us in the beginning of the Masters, and that's why I have the question in terms of the more I read about IGP's work, the more it's noticeable that we are talking about systemic change. And one thing that I learned is that systems are not broken, they just deliver what they were designed to deliver. So my question here is, from a systemic standpoint, what can we do in terms of prosperity thinking to intersect that with this need for systemic change?
Let me say first of all that the vast majority of the work that we do in the IGP does take this systemic approach. It looks at how you can bring about change through the intersection of multiple factors, right, across space and time. And this is extremely difficult to do. And you'll be seeing this in almost all of the modules and that you're taking, that perspective taken. You know, so whether it's a question of, you know, how can we stop the use of fossil fuels, or it's a question of how can we regenerate the planet, or it's a question of how can we deliver better food systems with better food sovereignty, or whether it's a question of what do we do about gender-based violence in all of this, or, you know, whatever that question is, how do we take an ethical approach to different kinds of challenges, and what does it mean for all of us when we say that we are trying to take people with us? In other words, that we're trying to expand the notion of social solidarity in order to operationalize it for future change. So these are all immensely difficult questions. But the point is that if you do not dedicate yourself to addressing these questions, then what are you doing in the current situation of crisis, right? And that's why you're all here, and that's why our panelists are here. And that is what they have demonstrated through their work. Let me start by thanking our four panelists, Matt, Joe, Marit, and Ruth.